beneath the sandstone floors of a temple that has stood on the banks of the Nile for more than 2,000 years. There's a carving that refuses to stay quiet. Online, it's called the Dendera Light. Recently, clips have spread across social media claiming that Grok, the AI chatbot built by XAI, was fed the carving's raw geometry, stripped of every religious label, and that it came back with a verdict researchers couldn't explain. It's a great hook. It's also worth being honest about right away. There's no verified, peer-reviewed study showing Grok or any other AI system independently discovered a hidden machine in an Egyptian relief. That specific claim appears to have started as speculative content on video platforms, not as a documented research finding. So instead of repeating it as fact, let's do something more interesting. Let's actually walk through what this carving is, why it has fascinated engineers and confused tourists for a century, what Egyptologists who spent their careers reading these walls actually say about it, and why the idea of ancient electricity keeps refusing to die no matter how many times it's addressed. The carving sits inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, in southern Egypt, a few hours north of Luxor. The temple you see today is not, strictly speaking, ancient Egyptian in the way the pyramids are. It was largely built during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek-descended pharaohs ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest, and finished under Roman emperors. That doesn't make it fake or unimportant. It means the temple is roughly 2,000 years old, built at a time when Egyptian priests were consciously preserving and recreating religious traditions that were already ancient even to them. Inscriptions inside genuinely do claim the temple's plans were copied from much older texts, supposedly reaching back to the time of the followers of Horus, a semi-legendary early period in Egyptian tradition. This isn't unusual boasting, either. Egyptian temples routinely claim deep antiquity for their designs as a way of asserting religious authority and continuity, the same way an old cathedral might emphasize that its foundations sit on the site of an even older church. Beneath the main halls of the temple, there really are crypts, narrow stone chambers built into the walls and floor, some of them accessible only through hidden doors or narrow shafts. This part isn't exaggerated. Dendera has some of the best preserved crypt systems in Egypt, and they were used to store temple treasures, ritual objects, and sacred images used only during specific festivals. Priests would seal these spaces most of the year and open them for particular ceremonies, which is exactly the kind of detail that fuels a secret chamber narrative, even though secrecy here had a religious and practical function, not a conspiratorial one. It's inside one of these crypts that you'll find the relief people now call the Dendera Light. The image shows an elongated oval or tube-like shape with a wavy line running through its interior, resting on what looks like a stand or a pillar shape, sometimes with small figures nearby holding or supporting it. If you didn't know anything about Egyptian religion and looked at it cold, it's genuinely easy to see why someone might think of a glass tube with a glowing filament inside, especially if you spend your working life around vacuum tubes or early electrical equipment. That resemblance is the entire engine behind this legend, and it's a real, understandable visual coincidence, not something invented by internet creators. The comparison to electrical equipment isn't new either. It goes back specifically to an Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Garn, who visited Dendera and argued the relief looked strikingly similar to a Crookes tube, an early device from the 1800s used to study electron beams and cathode rays, the ancestor of the modern light bulb and the CRT television. Garn's observations were picked up and popularized in the 1960s and 70s by writers like Erich von Däniken, whose book Chariots of the Gods argued that many ancient monuments were evidence of contact with extraterrestrial visitors. Von Däniken's work sold enormously well and shaped how a generation of readers thought about ancient mysteries, but has also been extensively criticized by historians and archaeologists for cherry-picking details, ignoring context, and making claims that don't hold up when you actually read the accompanying inscriptions. And that's really the heart of the disagreement. Egyptologists don't dismiss the light bulb comparison because they find offensive or because they're protecting some kind of orthodoxy. They dismiss it because the temple gives you the answer right next to the image, in writing. The hieroglyphic text accompanying the relief identifies the scene as part of the mythology of Harsamtis, a child god associated with the union of Horus and Hathor, emerging from a lotus flower, which in Egyptian religious art is closely tied to creation, rebirth, and the rising sun. The wavy line inside the tube is understood by Egyptologists who specialize in this period as a serpent, a very common motif in Egyptian cosmology, representing both protective and creative forces, sometimes shown emerging from a lotus blossom on a symbolic bark or support. This exact imagery, a serpent emerging from a lotus, appears elsewhere in Egyptian religious art in less ambiguous forms, which is one of the strongest arguments against the machine interpretation. If this were a unique, isolated image with no comparable religious counterpart anywhere else in Egyptian art, the technological reading would be far more compelling. It isn't unique. It fits into a recognizable visual vocabulary that Egyptologists can trace across multiple temples and time periods. There's also a physical detail that tends to get left out of the viral version of this story. If the object in the relief were meant to represent an actual electrical device, you'd expect to find some trace of real supporting technology nearby, something ancient Egyptians would have needed to actually power such a thing. Wiring, insulated conduits, a power source, burn marks, soot pattern consistent with an electrical short, or written technical descriptions describing construction and use. None of that has ever been found at Dendera or anywhere else in Egypt. What you do find, repeatedly, is the same religious grammar: lotus flowers, serpents, solar symbolism, and gods being born or reborn, themes that appear constantly throughout Egyptian temple art with or without a tube-shaped object nearby. None of this means a carving isn't genuinely striking to look at, or that people are foolish for noticing the resemblance. Visual pattern recognition works exactly the way you'd expect it to. Humans are extremely good at spotting familiar shapes in unfamiliar contexts, which is also why people see faces in clouds or animals in rock formations. An electrical engineer looking at a long tube with a curving line inside it is going to think of a vacuum tube, because that's the shape the profession trained him to notice. A historian trained in Egyptian religious iconography is going to think of a lotus and a serpent, because that's the shape her training recognizes. Both readings are honest responses to the same image. The difference is that one interpretation is backed up by the actual written text carved into the same wall, in a language modern scholars can read, describing an established mythological scene that appears elsewhere in Egyptian art. The other interpretation has to explain away that text and has never produced any supporting physical or documentary evidence beyond the visual resemblance itself. This is also where claims about artificial intelligence need to be handled carefully. It's true that AI image analysis tools, including large language models and specialized computer vision systems, are increasingly used in archaeology for things like reconstructing damaged inscriptions, comparing artistic styles across sites, or spotting forgeries. That's a legitimate and growing field. But there's a meaningful difference between a documented, published study using AI tools with named researchers and methodology you can check, and a video claiming an AI stripped an image of its labels and returned a mysterious verdict, with no link to any paper, dataset, or research team you can actually verify. When a claim like that circulates without a source you can trace, the responsible move isn't to repeat it as though it were settled science. It's to treat it the way you'd treat any unverified rumor. Interesting, worth watching for actual evidence, but not something to build a conclusion on yet. The other pieces of the story tend to get borrowed from real, separate mysteries and stitched together to make the Dendera claim feel bigger than it is. Take the question of how ancient Egyptian artists painted tomb ceilings deep underground without leaving soot. This is a genuine, long-discussed puzzle in Egyptology, and there are competing, reasonable explanations, including specially treated wicks and oils that burn cleaner than plain flame, and the use of angled bronze mirrors to bounce sunlight into interior chambers, a technique that's actually attested in some ancient contexts and has been tested experimentally with real results. It's a legitimate open question in archaeological science, but it has nothing to do with Dendera specifically, and its existence doesn't make the ancient light bulb claim any more likely. It just shows that ancient Egyptian craftsmen solved practical problems in clever ways, which nobody disputes. Then there's the Baghdad battery, a set of clay jars found near Baghdad, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, first described by German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig in 1938, when later researchers built replicas and filled them with an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice. The setup did produce a small measurable electric current, similar to a very weak galvanic cell. That part is genuinely reproducible and not in dispute. What is disputed heavily is what the jars were originally for. Many archaeologists and historians of science point out that no wires, electrodes, or plated objects have ever been found with these jars, and that the design closely resembles containers used to store papyrus or parchment scrolls, with the metal components possibly serving a completely different non-electrical purpose, such as a reaction vessel in an early metalworking or preservation process. The jars are real. The debate about their function is real and ongoing, but treating them as proof of a hidden ancient science of electricity that connects across an entire continent to an unrelated Egyptian temple, relief hundreds of years apart in time and culture, is a much bigger leap than the evidence supports. So, where does that leave the Dendera Light? Sitting exactly where it's been for 2,000 years, carved into limestone, in a language we can actually read, describing a story about divine birth, rebirth, and solar renewal, using a lotus and a serpent, one of the most consistent visual pairings in the entire span of Egyptian religious art. It's a genuinely beautiful, strange-looking image, and it's completely fair to find the resemblance to electrical equipment fascinating. Coincidental visual resemblance is a real and interesting phenomenon on its own, without needing an invented AI verdict to make it feel important. The honest version of this story doesn't need a secret conspiracy or a mysterious machine learning breakthrough to be worth telling. It needs the actual details. A temple built by Ptolemaic and Roman-era Egyptians consciously copying older sacred traditions, hidden crypts used for real religious festivals, an engineer in the 20th century who noticed a resemblance that stuck in the public imagination for decades, and hieroglyphic inscriptions sitting quietly right next to the carving the entire time, patiently explaining exactly what the artist meant. If there's a genuine mystery left in any of this, it isn't whether ancient Egyptians secretly had light bulbs. It's why a well-documented, thoroughly translated piece of religious art keeps getting reinterpreted every generation as evidence of lost technology, when the explanation carved right beside it has been sitting there the entire time, waiting for people to read it rather than around it. Ancient Egypt really did produce extraordinary engineering, precise astronomy, and genuinely clever solutions to hard practical problems. That reality is impressive enough on its own. It doesn't need an invented AI headline to make it interesting. It just needs someone willing to actually read the wall.